At the beginning of the war, Adolf Hitler was not alone in his decisions. He listened, he argued, and sometimes he even changed his mind. The German generals around him were professionals, men trained for decades in strategy, logistics, and command. In the early years, Hitler depended on them more than history often admits. Poland, France, the Low Countries, these victories were not achieved by Hitler alone. They were planned in map rooms by officers who believed they were fighting a traditional war. But slowly, something began to change. By 1941, Hitler no longer saw his generals as partners. He began to see them as obstacles. The first cracks appeared after the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be quick, a lightning strike that would crush the Red Army before winter. When the generals warned about distance, supply lines, and weather, Hitler dismissed them. He believed willpower mattered more than logistics. When the advance slowed and winter arrived, Hitler refused to accept reality. Instead of adjusting plans, he blamed the men around him. Retreats were forbidden. Withdrawals were called cowardice. Any general who suggested flexibility was accused of weakness. This was the moment when trust began to die. In meetings, Hitler stopped asking questions. He started giving lectures. Maps were no longer tools for discussion. They became stages where Hitler pointed, imagined armies that no longer existed, and demanded movements that could not be executed. Generals who tried to explain the truth were interrupted, humiliated, or removed. One by one, experienced commanders were sidelined. Some were dismissed quietly. Others were sent to meaningless posts. A few were arrested. By 1942, fear had replaced honesty inside German headquarters. Officers stopped reporting bad news. Losses were softened. Reality was delayed. The chain of command began to rot from the top. Hitler trusted numbers only when they confirmed his beliefs. When reports contradicted his vision, he called them lies. This growing isolation pushed him closer to blind loyalty and further from professional advice. Generals were no longer valued for their experience, but for their obedience. And this shift would soon cost Germany everything. Because when a leader stops trusting his generals, he stops trusting reality itself. And the war had only begun to punish that mistake. By 1942, the cracks in Hitler's command structure were no longer subtle. The German army was stretched across the Eastern Front, facing a relentless Soviet counteroffensive. The generals sent warnings, supply lines were collapsing, winter was approaching, and the enemy was regrouping. Hitler refused to listen. In his mind, retreat was treason. Withdrawal was weakness. Every suggestion that deviated from his plan was a personal insult. At the headquarters, meetings became theater. Maps were spread on tables, pins and markers showing territory lost or endangered. Generals presented facts. Hitler rejected them. He demanded advances that were impossible. When reality contradicted him, rage followed. It was sudden, public, and terrifying. Officers who spoke truth were dismissed or reassigned to distant posts. Some were even arrested under suspicion of disloyalty. The result? Communication broke down. Reports no longer contained honest updates. Field commanders hid losses, exaggerated successes, or ignored instructions they knew were suicidal. Orders became detached from reality. They were written for obedience, not for strategy. The turning point came at Stalingrad. Hitler insisted that the Sixth Army hold the city at all costs. Generals begged for retreat or resupply.
Every warning was met with accusations of cowardice. He refused to believe that Soviet forces were stronger than anticipated. When the city fell, the blame was not placed on flawed planning or misjudgment. It was placed on the officers who had survived to report the disaster. From that day, paranoia replaced logic. Hitler's trust in experienced generals was shattered. Only those who echoed his ideology or feared him remained close. Every decision became a test, not of strategy, but of loyalty. Civilian and military advice alike was ignored. The man who had once listened to his commanders now isolated himself in his beliefs. Meanwhile, the generals who remained were trapped. They obeyed instructions that they knew would fail. They executed operations doomed from the start. Casualties mounted, morale plummeted, yet no one dared speak out. By 1943, the situation was catastrophic. Even successes were hollow, temporary gains achieved at unsustainable costs. The army was bleeding manpower, and the generals, once masters of strategy, had become prisoners of obedience. Paranoia intensified when Hitler learned of plots against him. Officers who had once been loyal now feared for their lives. Some silently hoped for his removal. Others clung desperately to positions that allowed them to survive. The line between advice and treason had blurred completely. Trust, once the foundation of command, had vanished. By the time the Allies landed in Normandy in 1944, the consequences of this distrust were irreversible. Hitler's generals could no longer act with initiative. Every move had to be approved by a man who refused to believe the truth. Orders were delayed, counterattacks failed, and the German army, which had once seemed invincible, began its steady collapse. This was the day Hitler truly stopped trusting his generals, and from that day forward, the Third Reich was no longer guided by strategy, but by fear, ideology, and delusion. The war was slipping away, and there was nothing left to prevent it. By mid-1944, the cracks in the Third Reich had grown into chasms. Berlin was no longer a confident capital. It was a city under siege in anticipation, if not yet by immediate enemy artillery. Hitler's inner circle was shrinking. Generals who had once commanded respect now whispered in fear, wary of the consequences of a single misstep. The pivotal moment came on July 20th, 1944. A bomb was planted in the Wolf's Lair, the very headquarters where Hitler had secluded himself for planning. The conspirators were his own generals, men who had once been trusted allies. Their motivation was desperation, to stop the war, to save Germany from complete annihilation. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb exploded. The room was torn apart. Smoke, debris, and chaos filled the air, but Hitler survived. He had moved slightly, shielded by the conference table. The failure of the assassination attempt was immediate and absolute. The psychological impact, however, was immeasurable. Hitler realized in a stark, terrifying clarity that the people around him, the very men he had relied upon, could betray him at any moment. Trust had been shattered, not by defeat alone, but by treachery within his own ranks. In the days that followed, Hitler's behavior became increasingly erratic. Meetings with generals turned into interrogations. Every suggestion, every question was met with suspicion. He demanded written reports of loyalty. He required oaths multiple times from the same officers. Even those who had been closest to him were not spared. Fear became the currency of survival in the bunker. Meanwhile, the military situation deteriorated further. Allied forces advanced through France after D-Day.
The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure, yet Hitler refused to delegate real authority. Orders were rigid, unrealistic, and often suicidal. Commanders found themselves forced into impossible positions: obey, fail, and be accused of treason, or refuse and be executed. The result was catastrophic. Commanders stopped proposing alternatives. Initiative disappeared. Field decisions, once a matter of strategy, became exercises in survival. Soldiers on the front lines felt the absence of leadership. They fought, but without guidance, without hope. Hitler's paranoia did not stop at the generals. He scrutinized aides, ministers, and even family members. Loyalty was no longer enough. Blind obedience was required. Every minor failure, every unintended setback became proof of betrayal. Rumors, whether true or false, fueled his anger. Anyone who hesitated was suspected. Anyone who disagreed was an enemy. The fall of France had been rapid, the invasion of the Soviet Union initially overwhelming, but now the war had turned against Germany. And yet Hitler persisted in his delusions. Maps were studied for hours, plans redrawn and troops repositioned, all for maneuvers that could not succeed. Reality was filtered through ideology, not facts. Inside his headquarters, the psychological pressure reached its peak. Meetings were tense, silent, with generals exchanging glances, calculating every word. The risk of saying the wrong thing, of questioning an order, was lethal. In this atmosphere, strategy was dead. Only fear and obedience remained. By late 1944, Hitler's isolation was almost total. He no longer consulted his generals on critical decisions. He trusted only a handful of aides who would not contradict him. The rest became cogs in a machine, fueled by ideology, fear, and paranoia. Even outside the bunker, Germany was collapsing. The Allies bombed cities relentlessly. Bridges, factories, and communication lines were destroyed. Soldiers on the front lines faced shortages of food, ammunition, and morale. Yet Hitler remained convinced that a single bold strike, a miracle maneuver, could reverse the tide. But in reality, there was no turning back. The generals, once the backbone of German strategy, were now shadows, silent, powerless, and terrified. Their experience and knowledge were rendered useless by one man's refusal to trust. In these final months, every decision Hitler made carried devastating consequences. Troop movements failed, defenses crumbled, supply lines were lost. And behind it all, Hitler's mistrust continued to poison what little remained of Germany's command structure. The day Hitler stopped trusting his generals was not a single day. It was a slow, inevitable process. By July 20th, 1944, it became absolute. Betrayal was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty in his mind. From that moment, the Third Reich was governed not by strategy, but by fear, paranoia, and ideological obsession. And that fear would lead Germany into its final, unavoidable collapse. By early 1945, Berlin was no longer the confident capital of the Third Reich. It was a city under siege, surrounded by advancing Soviet forces from the east and crumbling defenses from the west. Hitler had retreated into the bunker, a concrete maze beneath the city, where reality met obsession. The generals who remained by his side were a shadow of the commanders who had once planned victories across Europe. The atmosphere was tense, suffocating. Officers moved silently through the corridors, avoiding the gaze of their leader, fearful that a single word could be interpreted as disloyalty. Meetings that once involved discussion and strategy were replaced by monologues.
Hitler dictated orders, ignoring the advice of seasoned commanders, refusing to acknowledge the collapse happening outside the bunker walls. Supplies were failing. Communications with the front were sporadic. Reports of troop losses arrived hours or even days late. Hitler's obsession with holding Berlin at all costs turned every order into a sentence of destruction. He demanded attacks that could not be supported, defenses that could not be manned, and miracles that could not happen. Even the generals who survived the July 20 assassination attempt were not safe. Suspicion had replaced trust. Every misstep, every hesitation was seen as betrayal. The room that had once been a hub of military expertise was now a chamber of fear. When one general suggested retreat to save the remnants of the army, Hitler's fury was swift and absolute. Threats were whispered, promotions rescinded, and officers reassigned to pointless positions. Meanwhile, outside the bunker, Berlin was slowly being destroyed. Soviet artillery pounded the city relentlessly. Smoke rose over shattered buildings. Civilians fled, hid, or were caught in the crossfire. The German army, once disciplined and feared, was now a fractured force, running on orders disconnected from reality. Soldiers hesitated, supplies were gone, morale had collapsed, and yet Hitler refused to face the truth. In the bunker, Hitler's daily routine was a ritual of delusion. He spent hours poring over maps, imagining troop movements that could not exist. He conducted meetings with aides and generals that were exercises in loyalty rather than strategy. Every plan was a test of obedience. Every suggestion of caution or retreat was a personal attack. As the days turned into weeks, paranoia intensified. Hitler distrusted even those closest to him. Eva Braun and a handful of loyal aides were his only confidants. He accused generals of plotting against him, of being spies or traitors. Fear dominated the bunker. Conversations were muted. Decisions were delayed or ignored. Experience was meaningless. Only ideology and blind obedience mattered. Outside, the Soviets advanced relentlessly. Every street, every building was contested. The remnants of German forces were unable to mount a coordinated defense, yet Hitler demanded holding ground that no soldier could defend. Every order led to casualties, every hesitation was punished, every failure was blamed on someone else. The collapse was both physical and psychological. Generals who once commanded thousands of men were reduced to anxious messengers. Soldiers became shadows of their former selves. Civilians lived in fear, trapped in a crumbling city, fearful of bombardment and reprisals. Hitler's isolation was complete. He no longer trusted anyone, and in turn, no one trusted him. Reality had been replaced with obsession. By mid-April 1945, the end was inevitable. The city was encircled, supplies were exhausted, communication with remaining army units was fractured. Hitler issued orders that could not be executed. Generals were powerless. Soldiers followed them blindly, knowing that each command would lead them into destruction. Inside the bunker, tension reached its peak. Hitler's speeches were long, rambling, filled with accusations and paranoia. Officers exchanged glances, calculating what words they could safely speak. Trust had died. Strategy was dead. Only fear and ideology remained. And yet, Hitler continued to make decisions, believing that somehow victory could still be achieved. The generals could only obey. Orders were carried out with meticulous adherence, despite being suicidal. Every action became a symbol of obedience rather than effectiveness. By the last week of April 1945, the situation was catastrophic. Berlin was surrounded. Soviet forces were on every side. The remaining German soldiers were exhausted, starving, and demoralized. Civilians were trapped in a crumbling city, fearful of bombardment and reprisals. Hitler's mental state deteriorated further. He refused to leave the bunker. He issued impossible orders. He rejected every report that contradicted his beliefs. This was the moment when the Third Reich was no longer commanded, it was imprisoned by fear. The day Hitler stopped trusting his generals had long passed. Now the collapse was complete. The war would end not with strategy, but with delusion, isolation, and destruction. The bunker was a stage, Hitler the actor. Reality had left the scene, and history was waiting outside the doors, ready to close the chapter on the Third Reich.
By late April 1945, Berlin was surrounded on all sides. The Soviet Red Army had crushed the outer defenses and was moving street by street into the heart of the city. Smoke rose over shattered buildings, artillery fire rattled every structure, and the cries of civilians echoed through bombed-out streets. Inside his bunker, Adolf Hitler remained isolated, refusing to leave, commanding from a concrete prison, convinced that somehow victory or survival was still possible. The generals who had once been the backbone of German strategy were now shadows. Some had been executed for perceived disloyalty, others dismissed or powerless. Those who remained obeyed instructions not to win the war, but to survive under the tyrannical gaze of a man who no longer trusted them. Fear ruled over reason. Orders became exercises in blind obedience rather than tactical brilliance. Hitler spent hours staring at maps. He imagined armies that no longer existed. He plotted counterattacks that were impossible to execute. He demanded movements of troops that had already been annihilated or surrounded. Every report that contradicted his visions was called lies. Every warning of defeat was considered betrayal. Eva Braun remained a rare source of comfort in the bunker, but even her presence could not ease the growing madness. Hitler's paranoia intensified. He accused loyal aides of conspiracy, demanded repeated oaths of obedience, and inspected every detail of bunker operations as though betrayal could strike from any corner. Outside, the city was being destroyed block by block. Soviet soldiers moved methodically, clearing buildings, engaging in brutal street fighting. German troops, exhausted, hungry, and demoralized, tried to hold positions dictated by orders that had no basis in reality. Every corner of the city became a battlefield, civilians trapped in the chaos. Supplies were non-existent, communications were fragmented. The German command was a hollow shell. Hitler refused to evacuate. He believed leaving the bunker would mean surrender, defeat, and humiliation. He clung to ideology over reality. He clung to the illusion that the German army could somehow rise again if his orders were followed perfectly. Generals offered advice, suggestions for retreat, or pragmatic strategies. Each was ignored, ridiculed, or punished. Trust was gone. Loyalty replaced judgment. Fear replaced reason. By April 29th, Hitler's mental state had deteriorated to the point of delusion. He dictated a political testament, naming successors, detailing his ideology, and attempting to justify the unthinkable. The generals remaining in Berlin realized that all hope for strategic intervention was lost. They had been rendered irrelevant. The decisions of one man, driven by paranoia and obsession, controlled the fate of a crumbling nation. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler made his final decision. He would not face capture. He would not escape. He would end his life, taking with him the delusion, the ideology, and the terror that had consumed Europe for over a decade. In the bunker, the final arrangements were made. Eva Braun joined him. The loyal aides followed instructions, preparing the scene. The world outside waited unknowingly for history to conclude one of its darkest chapters. As the hour arrived,
Hitler and Eva Braun took their lives. The Third Reich's leadership structure, already hollowed by paranoia and fear, collapsed completely. Generals who remained could only watch as the man who had stopped trusting them met his final fate. Berlin fell in the following days. The city and the nation were forever changed. The consequences of mistrust were clear. Hitler's refusal to believe in reality, to trust his commanders, and to act pragmatically had ensured that Germany's defeat would be total. The Third Reich, once a formidable force, had crumbled not just from external pressure, but from internal fear, suspicion, and the collapse of professional judgment. This was the day Hitler's isolation and paranoia reached its peak, the day trust died completely, and the consequences could not be reversed. History would remember it as the final hours of a tyrant, and a lesson in the dangers of blind obsession and broken leadership.
And that was the story of Hitler's final days in Berlin, the collapse of his generals, and the ultimate fall of the Third Reich. History teaches us that paranoia, mistrust, and obsession can destroy even the most powerful of empires. If you found this story gripping and want to see more untold history stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. Every week, we bring you deep dives into history, exploring wars, secrets, and events that shaped the modern world. Join us on this journey, one story at a time, and see history as you've never seen it before. Don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment to tell us what historical topic you want us to cover next. Your support helps us continue creating long, detailed, and cinematic videos just like this one.